Good afternoon, everyone. As Mel said, I'm a family physician. I'm also someone who's lived with Parkinson's disease now for over 2 decades. And I have the privilege of serving on the board of directors for the Davis Phinney Foundation, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Pandemic is a word that we've heard quite frequently in the last few weeks, particularly as it pertains to the novel coronavirus. What is a pandemic exactly? Well, there are many definitions, but probably the most comprehensive one I've heard is that pandemics are large-scale outbreaks, usually of an infectious disease, that can greatly increase morbidity and mortality over a wide geographic area and can cause significant economic, social, and political disruption. Well, as I mentioned, this is usually in the context of an infectious disease. The concept in some ways, I guess, can also be extrapolated to an illness like Parkinson's. That's why today's webinar is a Parkinson's pandemic coming, where we've been and where we're going? It is estimated that there are probably about 6 million people globally that are living with the challenges of Parkinson's disease, like you and I. And given the fact that our patient population is aging, our population in general is aging, this number is also likely to increase significantly. And the societal impact this could have is really quite staggering. I mean, one of the leading causes of disability around the world is neurological illness like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And we're not only talking about societal impact, but the impact on individuals themselves. More and more people having to face the challenges that we face every day, and really a huge disruption and negative impact on their quality of life and those of their social system and families. So to help us outline the issues at stake and the challenges we are facing is Dr. Michael Okun, a movement disorder specialist who is currently chair of neurology, professor, and executive director of the Norman Fiksel Institute for Neurological Diseases at the University of Florida Health College of Medicine. He's also one of the co-authors of the highly anticipated book, Ending Parkinsons, amongst others, actually, which is set to be released on March 17th. Welcome, Dr. Okun.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Mathur.
Dr. Okun, I gave a brief definition of the word pandemic, which, as I mentioned, is usually described to describe an outbreak of an infectious disease. But could you perhaps elaborate on a bit on how you feel this, what this would mean in the context of Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your description was really great. And when we think about this word, you know, in the English language, it actually goes back to the 1600s. And it's a word that has both Latin and a Greek derivation. And pan, P-A-N, means all, right? Mm-hmm. And demos in Greek means people. Right? So it's all people. So if you look across multiple dictionary definitions, Oxford, Merriam-Webster dictionary, it is really describing something that happens over wide geographical areas and affects a large proportion of people, right? So it's pan, all, demos, people, right? So the word pandemic, you know, really refers to that. Now, the word ends up being used most frequently for infectious diseases, which makes sense, right? And so we hear about different infectious things that go from continent to continent, whether it's flu or bird flu or COVID-19. And so, you know, it has a very important and specialized use in the modern world, but actually, historically, it's been around a long time. And so when we look at the context of something like Parkinson's disease and we say, well, it seems that a lot of people have it. It seems that it's across a lot of geographies, seems to be rapidly expanded. And in fact, it may be the most rapidly expanding neurological disease for unexplained reasons, even growing faster at a more rapid rate than Alzheimer's disease. And we can't account for this just based on age or other factors. Then we really do have something that's growing across a lot of people. Now, I don't want people to get hung up on the word pandemic because, you know, Parkinson hasn't been proven to be an infectious disease. We don't think of it as an infectious disease. So I don't want people to get confused. But the point I want to make is 1 in 15 of us, you know, 1 in 15. That means if you were in a classroom of 30 when you grew up, 2 of you are going to get Parkinson's disease in your lifetime. You know, and these numbers are rising for various reasons: industrialization, risk factors, age, and so the idea of describing it as a pandemic isn't far-fetched, and it isn't, I think, a very irresponsible term to use. But I think when we use it, we should just remember that it's not an infectious disease, but we're concerned that we're going to overload the system. All these cases are going to be too much for Medicare in the United States and other agencies around the world to be able to handle this public health challenge, because it is exploding in numbers.
Right. Taking into consideration sort of the inherent difficulties we have in accurately estimating numbers of Parkinson's disease globally, do you have an idea of what the numbers are now compared to what we maybe see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we have some idea. One of the co-authors on the book Ending Parkinson Disease is Ray Dorsey, and he's done a tremendous amount of work on this. And a lot of the estimates tell us, if you look at periods, epochs, so let's say we look at the epoch between 1990 and 2005, we see a more than doubling, okay, of Parkinson. Then if we look at the epoch from now until 2040, it's going to weigh more than double, again. And so this is huge, and not completely explained by just the fact that our population is aging. And so I think we have to take notice at the climbing number of cases.
So there are many other diseases that sort of increase as the population ages. What are the most urgent concerns regarding the increase in Parkinson's specifically? Like why are we worried about Parkinson's specifically?
So if we look at the demographics of what's happened in the world, the greatest advance in the last 100 years, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, but not all, is not the computer. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the iPad, as my kids would say. It's not cell phones, okay? It's the doubling of the lifespan, okay? So with the doubling of the lifespan, okay, what we now have set ourselves up for is the human body going longer than it was probably designed to go. And you have a higher risk for degenerative conditions as you age. So being male and also living a long time are two things that set you up for Parkinson. The second thing is that there has been an explosion since the 1800s, 1900s, and now into the 2000s of industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
And the more industrialized societies seem to be growing at more rapid rates. And so we're starting to see a collective amount of literature telling us that there's some link between maybe the pesticides and the things that could be environmentally influencing. So we have a situation where people are living longer, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. And as people are living longer lives, there's going to be more people with degenerative diseases. We've industrialized, and then there are probably other factors that we don't yet understand. But we're seeing an explosion in the number of cases, and it's going to, bankrupt, as I said before. It's going to bankrupt healthcare systems.
Right. And this question from a viewer actually is quite timely. And they ask, why are a lot more people being diagnosed with Parkinson's at a younger age?
Yeah. So
Is that a true change, or are people just getting diagnosed, I guess, before when they weren't getting diagnosed before?
yeah. So thank you for the question. That's a great question. And I'll just say, just stepping back for a moment, that when I talk to people and they say, what's your life like? What's your clinic like? And you know, they believe stereotypically that I'm seeing a very geriatric aged population in my clinic of Parkinson patients. And when I tell them I see Parkinson patients in their teens, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, they're just blown away.
Mm-hmm.
And 10% or more of the Parkinson population is diagnosed now before the age of 40. Are the numbers going up in that group? I think the numbers are going up in all groups, so it's hard to know if that group is rising faster than others. A lot of the cases are not associated with the classical features, so they may not have tremor, or they may have other features like dystonia or neuropsychiatric problems or smell problems or sleep problems or constipation. And so I think we've missed the diagnosis in some cases, and hopefully we're getting better with that, although that takes time. And so I think there is that proportion of just people assuming, well, you must not have Parkinson. I mean, you're young. I mean, this can't be Parkinson. It must be something else. And so we're beginning to see practitioners come around to understanding that this is actually Parkinson. And we've seen people who have lived with it for long periods of time. Now, the younger cases, I should mention for your questioner, are more commonly associated with a genetic problem with their Parkinson, a single DNA change. But not all of those cases are associated with a known genetic problem. And so we are seeing more and more young onset Parkinson. I think we're becoming more savvy about diagnosis, and we don't yet have the data to say with certainty that this is due to something like environmental pesticides or toxins or things. But stay tuned, because I think, we'll get more data on that.
Right. So it's basically that Parkinson's in general is increasing, and therefore the young onset population, because of better diagnosis and the whole population increasing, it seems to have more numbers. Is that?
That's what we know, but there's a
Yeah.
whole bunch that we don't know. So
Right.
in deference to the question that was asked, it's very it's very possible that there could be factors that are driving people to unmask their Parkinson earlier. And it could also
Right.
be that people are destined to get Parkinson's. So we have these genes, right? We have this
Right.
DNA. We're destined to have certain things, and certain things we don't want to know we're going to have. Like, I don't want to know if something's going to
Yeah.
happen. But, it could be that certain factors in the environment bring them out or unmask
Right.
them earlier than we might see them. So that's another explanation. But this is
Right.
highly speculative, and
Mhm.
I think we'll get more data in the next 5, 10, 15 years on this question.
Yeah, I think that whole concept of sort of genetics loading the gun and environment pulling the trigger is kind of one that can be used for a lot of diseases, actually. So it's quite interesting.
Yes, I agree with that.
The other question I'm getting is, why is Parkinson's increasing? I think you mentioned at a faster rate than, say, Alzheimer's or other neurological illnesses. Do we know why it would be that way?
We don't know why. In the book Ending Parkinson, it gives us a chance. Authors have license, right? So we take a little bit of license. We give ourselves a little bit of latitude to begin to explore some of those reasons. Why? Could it be genetics? Could it be environment? Could it be exposures of people to various things? Could it be the industrialization question? And certainly we're seeing more and more exposure to various chemicals that are in our environment. And could that be driving this train along? And I'll just give you a couple of examples. And people
Sure.
know the example of Agent Orange and dioxin. It's named Agent Orange because of those orange barrels that they were carried in and used in Vietnam, but also to spray other areas. And so certainly the veterans are receiving benefits, and there's now multiple studies that show that there's a higher association with Parkinson. But if we look at other barrels, so, there are other barrels of chemicals. The blue barrel, nobody talks about the blue barrel. The blue barrel is TCE, trichloroethylate. It's been used to degrease things. It's been used for dry cleaning, getting spots off of dry cleaning. It's a great cleaning compound, very high association with Parkinson's disease. If we look at something like paraquat, paraquat's been banned in 32 countries, including China. And the FDA, we were trying to move toward it, but in the last year or two, it's been stopped again. And the numbers of cases of the use of paraquat in the U.S. continues to skyrocket and go up. And this is used as a pesticide, highly associated with Parkinson, cancers, and other things as well. And so this may be part of what's driving this turn to industrialization. And one of the things that Ray Dorsey points out is, when you look at industrialized countries versus non-industrialized countries, it does appear that industrialized countries may have a faster or more rapid rate of Parkinson's disease than others. And then one of the examples, Bas Bloem, who's an author, is in the Netherlands, and they've taken very aggressive steps to limit pesticide use, and that seems to be a country where we're seeing a downturn in the numbers.
Right.
So, these are early days, and these types of studies, everybody should be aware, need to be replicated. We need to be putting our data together. There are multiple data sources. We know farmers are at higher risk. Certain states like Nebraska are collecting data and putting it together. And we know if you live closer to farms and areas with pesticides, your risk is higher. And so it's super important for us to prevent the disease, to also be able to start to give people pretty good advice as to what may be contributing to this problem.
Yeah, it's just so strange that, something can be illegal in one country, yet being used quite commonly in another when there's evidence that it's not good for you. There are no global standards or guidelines that are out there.
So, we try our best, I think country by country, to address these things. Some are doing better than others. We were on a better path with the Environmental Protection Agency here, and then just in the current administration, as things have come up, they've been blocked. Like the paraquat thing was probably going to happen, and then now the EPA has taken the regulatory break off of that one. We haven't moved on TCE, and so some countries like Sweden and the Netherlands and other places are doing way better than the United States. Even China's doing better than the United States in a chemical that should worry everyone called paraquat in the Parkinson world. So
There's a couple of environmental questions that are here as well. One person wrote that they heard that golf course players have more cases of Parkinson's. Is that true?
So I'm not sure of the exact association of golf and Parkinson in any large study. However, as golf courses are large, they are green, and they get sprayed with pesticides. And so playing a lot of golf on courses that have been sprayed with a lot of pesticides probably does pose some risk. And the risk is going to depend on how much exposure you have. And so in these types of studies, they have occupational experts that are part of the methods of these studies, and they actually try their best to figure out through a series of scientific questions, and they try to triangulate and figure out how much exposure that you've had. And so if you're exposed to, a golf course that's sprayed a lot, and let's say you played a lot while it was being sprayed, that may increase your risk. But the definitive study of golf courses and Parkinson disease hasn't been done. Although I'll tell you, when I was a kid, I lived in a neighborhood where there were golf courses close, and then we had these trucks that would spray pesticides called the stink trucks, and you used to ride after the trucks on your bike, and they'd spray this horrible smell, toxins and things. And so we hear, as this has come out, we hear these types of stories from a lot of people, and so we've had these unintended, unforced errors and exposures. And so I think people should be aware of that. Now, if you have Parkinson's disease, be aware that these are risk studies. They're like Vegas, we make odds. But if you have Parkinson's disease already, that doesn't, then by all means play golf, right? Because you've already gotten, the disease, you don't need to worry about modifying your risk. The risk modification would happen in people who are at risk, before they get the disease. And so that's one of the key principles that we talk about, which is prevention.
Right. Are there other things that you feel are holding back the field from progressing, things like funding or that sort of thing?
So one of the things that we talk a lot about in ending Parkinson is, we need to take a lesson from history, and we need to look at other diseases and where people have been successful. And so it's not like a chapter book. It's not a book, where you're going to read one chapter at a time. It's a book where we're beginning to try to build a case and make a point. And so one of the stories that we tell in the book is about the story of polio and how the groups come together, and what are the factors, what are the elements necessary, what were the elements necessary for people to get in front of that disease and really cut it off. HIV, how did that disease get changed from something that when I was in training was, an incurable, terrible, horrible disease to now something that is much more controllable, much more chronic, and people are living happy lives with that disease. Breast cancer, where it's gone in the last 20 or 30 years. How are these groups doing it, and where have we fallen down in Parkinson? And so we sort of studied this and began to look at the factors and tried to learn from history what are the major components. And so we came up with what we call the pact, and we think everybody should take the Parkinson Pact. I think we should all things. So the P is for prevention. The A is
Mhm.
for advocacy. So prevention would be things like ban the pesticides, figure out the causes, lead a cleaner life. If there are going to be diets or things that we can discover through research, we should by all means, be preventing the disease if we can. A is advocacy. We need to be stronger advocates. I think that we all believe we're strong advocates, but when you read the stories of polio and you read the stories of HIV, you'll realize that we have not reached that level, that heated up level that they had. I mean, the HIV group stormed the FDA, and took over
Yeah,
the FDA buildings. They put a condom over Jesse Helms's house,
yeah,
they really, made their point and their voices. And polio, they all, mailed dimes into the White House, the March of Dimes, and Franklin Roosevelt. And so we have to get a larger sense of advocacy, and we need to come together more as a community. We're not there yet in Parkinson's disease. And so it's not that I want to criticize everybody. So I want to challenge you to say, we got to take the packs. We got to prevent, we got to advocate, we got to
hmm,
care. We got to care for all the people that have the disease. And people that know me know I always talk about you can live a happy life with Parkinson, a meaningful life. And one of the biggest myths is that you can't treat it, that there are no
right,
treatments, for it. And people think of it like Lou Gehrig's disease or Alzheimer's. And of course, we know people that have had Parkinson for 20, 30, 40 years and live great lives. And I'm talking to one of them right now, being interviewed by one of them right now. But we've got to care for the generation, that has it, and the generations that are coming. And then finally, we've got to develop new treatments and novel treatments and emerging treatments that in multiple avenues. And part of that is advocacy. The A really and the T come together, because right now, the federal funding in the United States, which is the largest single funder of research, medical research in the world, okay,
mhm,
the funding for Parkinson is just under $300 million a year. To get
mhm,
to the level we need to with HIV and other diseases, 3 billion a year, okay,
yeah,
factor of 10. So we need to be more effective advocates. We need to push more dollars in. We need to be doing more research, and we need to be exploring both the symptomatic, the therapies that can help people now, but also therapies that can slow progression and move toward precision medicine approaches. That, in my mind, is going to take the full pact. And so one of
right,
the reasons that Ray Dorsey and Boss Bloom and Todd Scherer and I wrote this book is, we want it to be a little controversial, honestly. We wanted to challenge people, but we want people to start talking about what it is that we need to do as a community to move the needle. We need to lean in and we need to move the needle. And so if people aren't thinking about these things, and I know maybe they don't like the word pandemic, and that's fine. I take that as a good criticism. Maybe they don't like, talking about the environment. I take that as a criticism. However, I would just say in total, we need to dialogue about these things. We need
mhm,
to have some good, honest, listening and talking back and forth, involving more people, pushing more money into this equation, getting our advocacy efforts up, getting our prevention efforts up, caring for our people and treating. That's going to be the path forward.
right. I mean, we often hear that the Parkinson's community is too quiet, too polite. We need to be louder and more demanding in order to affect real change. But and everything that you've mentioned is absolutely on point. But where do we start? Like, where should we start as a community? Are there sort of low lying fruit that can be picked a little easier than others?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's a great question. I think the first thing is getting involved. So I think that's the, the first and most important step is getting involved. The more people that come together across the world, you've got millions of people that are affected. So that means you've got tens of millions of family members and friends, right?
Hmm.
A huge number of people. And I haven't seen, those huge numbers of people coming out together in force with a singular voice and saying, we're ready to move the needle here. We've had enough. This is really important. There's a lot of people waiting for these therapies. And so I think we need to more effectively come together. That's one. Two, I
Hmm.
think we need to be less fearful about being politically correct about the issues, and we need to discuss them and get them out. Now, you can imagine if the HIV researchers had been politically correct about, like what they did, they said, well, we're going to be politically correct. We're going to do this, they weren't. And you would say, wow, that was a big mistake. But look back, that was not a mistake. I mean, they were loud, they were vocal, they were on point, and sometimes they were off point. But they created a dialogue, and we're not creating as much dialogue as we should. And part of that is we need to be disruptive. So that means we need to be disruptive in our approaches. We need to not be afraid to try different things and see what sticks and what doesn't. We need to be not afraid to make a mistake. We need to not be afraid to invest in some things that may not go anywhere, but may, lead us, down the right path, or paint the paths that we shouldn't go down. And we need to communicate better among ourselves, both among
Right.
people that have Parkinson, but also the researchers and the family members. And frankly, we need to take advantage of the group of people that support Parkinson patients as being part of this movement. And I just, I don't want to, open myself up to too much fruit being thrown at me, but I just don't feel like we're doing a good enough job at this. And the final thing is getting our Parkinson patients to volunteer for clinical trials, so
Mm.
that we don't have trials that are sitting open, so we can answer the questions and we can turn the page, we can share the information, we can move forward. So so
Absolutely.
we need to be disruptive. So yeah, that's what
Right.
I would say.
Well, the HIV movement has long been held up as an example of, what can and should be done by a community to further the demand for prevention, better treatments, accessible management. Are there certain myths that we have in our own community or in the public's view that kind of stunt us a little bit in terms of being as active as we should be?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest myth is in diagnosis, and
Mhm.
that people think, oh, you can't have Parkinson's disease, you're too young, you're too old, you don't have a tremor. Some people don't have a tremor. And so I think there's a lot of myths about getting the diagnosis right. And if you don't get the diagnosis right, then how can you get to the next step? And we have underestimated how important it is to get people the right diagnosis. People can handle the truth. We need to get people the right diagnosis, and we need to deliver it in an empathetic way, but also educate them about what Parkinson is and what it is not, and how they could live meaningful lives with this disease, with a chronic disease. And many of my patients tell me their lives are actually better after the diagnosis of Parkinson. Let me say that again. Many of my patients say their lives are more meaningful after the diagnosis of Parkinson. It brought something to their lives, whether it's perspective or another way to look at the world or opportunity. And so they look at it as part of their life's journey. The
Right.
other myth is that there are no treatments for Parkinson's disease. This is a huge myth. And, we sit here together, and maybe you and I, and maybe the 500 people that are on live, or more people that are on live here today, maybe they understand this, but guess what? It turns out that the greater world doesn't. Like if we took a Quinnipiac survey, or a Pew survey poll, how many people think Parkinson is treatable? I guarantee you we would lose.
Right.
And so that is a huge myth. The other myth is about the young and the old. You can be young, you can be old. You can have tremor. You don't necessarily have tremor. There are 20 motor and non-motor symptoms of Parkinson. It is the most complex disease in clinical medicine. It has this amazing response to dopamine. No other disease has that. This amazing response to deep brain stimulation, or putting lesions in the brain, or however you're going to treat it. I mean, it has these fantastic offs and ons that are either the greatest thing in the world or the most challenging for people.
Right.
And so this disease is pretty complex, and I think it opens itself up to a lot of myths, and even some of our celebrity ambassadors like Michael J. Fox have been accused by mainstream, media sources of faking their dyskinesias,
Right.
and things like that. And so there's a lot of myths, and I think that really highlights the point that we were talking about earlier, where we need to educate people, get more people on the bus, and when more people are on the bus, then we'll be able to dispel these things.
Right. I think that most patients or people associate treatment with a cure. And I think that's possibly where some of that goes awry. But when you talk about treatments, you mentioned medication, dopamine replacement, you mentioned DBS or brain lesioning. What other sorts of treatments are you talking about when you say that there are treatments for Parkinson's?
Yeah, so we recently wrote a review in JAMA about this, Dr. Melissa Armstrong and I, and the field has changed. It's moved too. I'm happy to say, and we think of exercise and physical and occupational and speech therapy and social work and counseling as first line therapies for Parkinson. And in fact, we know now from collective evidence from dozens of studies that the non-motor symptoms, not the tremor, rigidity, walking problems, the non-motor symptoms, depression, anxiety, sleep problems, these are more disabling than the motor features, right? And so now that we know this, we have to put it into action. And so it is, just as important for us when we peddle drugs to actually have people on regular daily exercise programs. That's what the experts are doing. That's what the data shows us. We're now data driven on that, to take advantage of therapists to create specific plans for patients so they can interact with their environment appropriately, get their activities of daily living done, use all sorts of tips and things with the occupational therapist. They're walking with the physical therapist, checking on the speech and swallowing is a big quality of life issue, making sure you don't, bring something down the breathing tube and get pneumonia. And so these things are just as important
Right.
as the medications. And then in combination, you've got the medications, you've got these behavioral therapies, and then for some select group of patients, there's even some surgical therapies now with deep brain stimulation and focused ultrasound, and then also giving dopamine through a tube in the stomach, duopa. And so there are a lot of options over the lifetime of a patient, and it really is a precision medicine exercise. And
Right.
and speaking of myths, I think people just think, wow, like just write the Parkinson patient off, it's over. It's not. You get yourself a good medical team, and you do preventative things, get out in front. You're doing the therapies as well, add the medicines when you need to, change dosages and timing when you need to, add on a surgery. I mean, you can have a great life with this disease, and I think it's a really powerful message. And it's so refreshing to me to see people when they travel long distances to come here to the Fixell Institute, and they feel like they're washed up and they walk out with a new lease on life. And so it's really important for us also to educate general doctors, family practice doctors, general neurologists, not to write off the Parkinson patients, because there's a lot of great life there. And like I said, some are gonna come back and say, man, this disease saved my life. It didn't take my life. So
Yeah.
it's important.
Absolutely. And I think everything you said makes total sense in terms of quality of life improvement. I'm wondering though, is there any evidence to say that the disease can be delayed or prevented with these measures that people might be taking? And people that are supposed to, that may be at higher risk because of genetic mutations or premotor symptoms or something that would, the suspicion would be high that they would develop it. Has there been any studies along those lines?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I always explain it to patients and families in three buckets. So you've got, the types of therapies that we're interested in bucket number one would be something that would slow the disease down, have some meaningful impact on the disease symptoms that might slow this disease down. And if you slowed it down, not to not to make light of this, but if you slowed it down, maybe heart disease or lung disease or something else would, or prostate if you're a man, maybe something else would be the problem. That would be okay, right? And so we call those disease modification or therapies that might slow the disease in some meaningful way, or even in the symptomatic area. The center bucket are meaningful symptomatic treatments, medications, therapies, deep brain stimulation, new neuromodulation techniques. That's where we've been really good, except for in things like walking, talking, and thinking. Particularly those therapies we really need to develop. And then the third box is cures. And everybody likes to throw the C word around. And the things that have the highest potential for cure are going to be single gene deficits that could be attacked in one way or another, but Parkinson isn't one disease. And so getting to a cure, when people promise you that, or they're raising money or on that issue, it's a little more complicated. Diseases are difficult to cure in general. So back to bucket one, which is what you asked about. I'm sorry to take so long to get back to the question. It turns out that people will claim, I've vetted a lot of claims over the years from a lot of different continents. People will claim they have disease modifying therapies, particularly in the animals, and maybe they do, but we're still yet to have something that definitively gets a label from a regulatory agency like the FDA saying that we have actually modified disease progression. The closest we came was a monoamine oxidase inhibitor called rasagiline, and there's debate over that study that appeared in the New England Journal, but the vote was unanimous by the FDA in the United States that it wasn't disease modifying, wouldn't be given that label. The more recent debate is whether exercise can slow disease progression. But again, to do these studies, we're either going to need thousands of patients or a great what's called biomarker. So something that we can use to track the progression of the disease. So some sort of marker. And then if we have that marker, then we only need hundreds of patients instead of thousands of patients. And so here I work with a very talented researcher named David Valancourt, and he's developing an MRI marker of free water imaging. And so, if we could use that and go from thousands of patients to hundreds of patients, we can test more therapies. And so I think the hope is there, but I don't want to inflate and say that we're there. Bucket number one, we've spent a lot of money on, and we haven't filled that bucket up. Bucket number two, man, we filled that thing up to the brim with therapies, but not the walking, talking, thinking therapies. And bucket number three, the precision medicine cure bucket is still empty.
Well, now that we're on the topic, let's talk about the pipelines that are coming down to fill those buckets. What's on the horizon for future of Parkinson's treatments? You mentioned the disease modifying drugs. What specifically are we looking at?
Yeah, so this is, one of the things that that patient groups, I've had the privilege of traveling all over the world and talk to patients, and it's one of the greatest gifts I get, I think, in my own career is listening to people. But I know now not to ever make the mistake of talking in front of a group of Parkinson patients and not being ready to talk about what's new. And a long time ago, we said in the 10 secrets to a happier life, always press your doctor. The last question should always be, the 10th secret should be ask them what's new. So the things that we're really interested in now are pretty interesting and hopefully promising. And so we're seeing an influx of studies on inflammation and on the immune system, and using the immune system to remove some of the bad players in Parkinson's disease. So whether it's a vaccine-based approach or dropping inflammation or working on training the immune response itself to go after and clear these things out of the brain. One of the big issues is we've done this in Alzheimer's disease. It didn't have the effects that we expected, and whether or not if we can clean your brain, imagine taking a toothbrush and cleaning all the bad proteins off. Does it still mean you have Parkinson, but you just have a clean brain? Do you get symptomatically better? Does it modify disease progression? Where does it fall on those buckets? We don't know, but we're going to find out. Okay, we're going to find out really quickly in the next 5 years. So that'll be an exciting advance. There are several precision medicine approaches that are going on for people with specific gene defects with Parkinson disease, so DNA problems with the GBA mutation and the LRRK2 mutation. There's several types of drugs, and precision medicine looks at that, and people are talking about gene therapies. And so I think we'll see some pretty interesting things along that road. In the microbiome and the diet, we're learning all sorts of really cool and interesting things. And as we open that book, we're like, oh my God, I can't believe like what this connection is between the gut and the brain. And we can take animals and we can manipulate the gut and it changes the Parkinson. And it's just this mind-blowing stuff that we are just beginning to understand. But it's opened the door to starting to think about how can we understand the microbiome better. If we manipulate it in one way or another, does that impact risk, and could it be a treatment for diets and things? And so I think you're going to see a load of things coming out in the next 5 years in that area. We've gotten really good at modulating the brain and neuromodulation, and so we can put electricity into the brain, but now we're starting to see lots of different companies come in, lots of different scientists, how we give the stimulation, how fast, how slow, how we shape it, where we can get it to go, how we can get the network to communicate with each other. Could we get it to only turn on when there are certain symptoms present and certain brain signals? So we're seeing a huge influx of new technologies into that area, which is very exciting. We're seeing optogenetics, which is a field where we try to control cells and pathways down to millisecond control, turning things on and off to understand circuits and to guide us. They call it optogenetically inspired neuromodulation or deep brain stimulation. So we're seeing lots of things there. We're seeing what's called DREAD approaches, and DREAD stands for designer receptors exclusively activated by designer drugs. So DREAD. So we're seeing DREADs now in animals, and perhaps we'll see some scaling up. So, there's some pretty exciting things going on, but I'll just say for the people that are listening in, I get it. We all get it. Ray and Todd and Boss and I, we get it. We think of the people with Parkinson's disease. You're standing on top of the world looking at your watch. There's a great photograph that I love of that. And I always think of that when I take care of patients, because we talk about all these great things, but we know you're looking at your watch, you're standing on the world, and it means a lot that we hurry up and get it done. And so as part of the pact, we need to hurry up and catalyze more money in and get some more good ideas. But those are some of the things that are being looked at that I think are particularly exciting.
So while we look at our watch, what can we as a community do to help herald these treatments through the clinical trials and whatever needs to be done to get them into the hands of patients?
So as a community, I think making sure that you volunteer for clinical trials, is important. Obviously, don't ever volunteer for something you're not comfortable with, but the more people that we can, get into clinical trials, the faster we can get to answers. And don't just volunteer for the drug studies or the device studies, because we need people to volunteer for the biomarker studies, blood, CSF, spit, imaging studies, because remember what I told you, the development of biomarkers can change the trajectory here, where we don't need thousands of people like a cancer study anymore. We can only need hundreds, but we're still in search of those markers to be able to do that. Now, where can you do that? Well, I always direct patients. There's a federal registry called clinicaltrials.gov, clinicaltrials.gov. And if you go there on Google, it's sponsored by the federal government. You can see all the trials that are registered, usually throughout the world. So you can look for Parkinson, you can look for specific search terms, you can look for specific people. You can see if there are things that fit and where they are and where these studies are being offered. There's also clinical trial finders. And so there's a great one, Fox, Michael J. Fox has a Fox clinical trial finder. Parkinson Foundation has a free 1-800-4PD-INFO, 1-800-4PD-INFO helpline with nurses. They can also help you to direct you to where good care as well as clinical trials are. And so just getting involved, being willing to get out there to take the pact, to say, you know, we've got to prevent, we've got to advocate, we need you in the A in a big way. You know, we'll try to care for you, but in order to do that and develop new treatments, we're going to need you to be involved and get your friends involved and get your friends involved. We need many more people at the table to try to move that needle.
Absolutely. There's a few questions about treatments. If we could just go through a few of the listeners' questions. One says, well, she's concerned that you had mentioned that rasagiline doesn't slow down Parkinson's because her husband was just placed on it for that reason. So if you could maybe just briefly talk about rasagiline and what has been found.
So let me clarify by saying this is a debated topic. Okay.
Okay.
So though the FDA has voted, to, unanimously not to give it labeling for disease modification, doesn't mean that it doesn't modify disease. It means
Okay.
that the evidence level that they saw wasn't high enough for them to be sure enough to put it on the package label.
Mm.
There are still studies ongoing of this, and the original New England Journal study, the 1 milligram dose seemed to show disease modification. The 2 milligram dose didn't, and it created this whole storm of controversy around that study. There are now follow-up studies looking at imaging and other modalities to see if there's actually changes went on and off rasagiline. There may be a story there. Now, does it modify disease progression in a large scale, large effect size, like you're going to take rasagiline and you're going to live forever, with your Parkinson's disease? It's certainly not that, but it may have some meaningful disease modifying properties that we don't understand for specific patients. Also remembering that Parkinson isn't one disease. So there may be groups of patients who could benefit from certain therapies, and we're just at kind of this elementary basic level where we can't tell the difference, and we can't tell people where to go or who to go to. So I think rasagiline has both mild symptomatic effects, and there's a possible disease modifying benefit. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. If you're on rasagiline, I think it's a good drug. A lot of my patients are on that and other monoamine oxidase inhibitors.
Okay, great. Thank you. Someone also was asking about current gene therapy clinical trials. Where are we with gene therapy?
Yeah, so the two areas, and there's an initiative now by Parkinson Foundation. I think there's also one through Michael J. Fox Foundation. There's been a push to get people to get their gene status. And if you have your gene status and you have the GBA mutation or the LRRK2 mutation, there are studies that you could qualify for, and some of these studies might be medication studies, like there's an LRRK2 inhibitor study. Some of these might be gene therapy studies. And so the first and most important step is to understand your genetic status, your genetic profile. Some people do that through 23andMe, which can show you some of the common genetics. But if you want to go a little bit deeper than that, you may want to go to either a center of excellence or some place that does a lot of Parkinson patients and can direct you to more comprehensive panels, either done by the experts there or sent off to an expert. But in order to qualify for gene therapy, your first step is find out, do you have one of the common genes? And because GBA and LRRK2 are the most common, those are the first ones that are going to get the most attention.
Great. And one other person, in response to the discussion about environmental exposure, asks if you recommend heavy metal testing.
I do not. As a neurologist, heavy metal testing can be useful for diagnosis of certain things like neuropathies. Occasionally, if somebody poisons somebody else with arsenic, you can get these little lines on your fingernails called Mies lines. So there are little tricks. But see, this is where you don't want to get out too far in front of your doctors. If you go to a neurologist and they examine you and they see other manifestations of heavy metal toxicity, then they may want to test you for heavy metals. But every Parkinson patient should not be tested for heavy metals. There are some epidemiologic studies that have been sort of plus minus on this topic, depending on the metals. But there may be some correlations to iron, copper, other things. And certainly when you look at imaging, there's a lot of iron deposition in the brain. But that doesn't mean that heavy metal testing is going to get you anywhere. Now, There are places in the country that will offer you chelation. They'll say, oh, here's your heavy metal testing, and you can sign up for my therapy out of pocket, and I will take your blood and chelate it or separate the heavy metals out of it. That is definitely not something that that we recommend that patients do, but it is like one of those, cleanse your body of the bad Parkinson, and that has not worked out well for the patients that have done that.
Is Parkinson's related to amyloidosis?
So amyloidosis is a specific disorder. It can cause neuropathies. It can cause autonomic symptoms. It can get in your heart. We don't have a very specific link between amyloid and Parkinson disease in the larger sense of amyloidosis. And then there's certain forms of amyloid that are associated with other degenerative diseases. But in Parkinson disease, with the amyloidosis, which was the question, no, we haven't uncovered it. Doesn't mean that it's not there, but we haven't really uncovered it at this point.
Okay. Well, I'd like to sort of bring it back to the advocacy discussion, because actually in your pact, advocacy can play a role in any of those arms, if you think about it. And I think this book and the topic is really important for patient advocates. It's my friend who is a super advocate, Tom Isaacs. I'm sure you met him many times. He said, when you become an advocate, you go from being needy to being needed. And you're at the point where you sort of turn your focus outwards towards your patient community as opposed to your own struggles, which of course are also important to address. So I'm really looking forward to reading the book and learning more details of what we touched on today. I've pre-ordered my copy, actually. But as we wrap up, do you want to let our participants know why you and your co-authors wrote this book? What is it you hope that readers will take away from it?
Yeah, so thank you for the question and also for the chat today. We wrote Ending Parkinson Disease because we need to get more involved too. And as we wrote the book, we realized how bad we've been too as medical professionals in the field and doctors. It's not enough for us just to care for patients. Our voice needs to be bigger. The voice of the community needs to be bigger. We need to do more, and we feel like if we do more, we can really get in front of the disease. We know that 1 in 15 people are going to get Parkinson in a lifetime. We know that the population is aging, and we know that the rapid rise in Parkinson is even faster than the rise in Alzheimer's disease and in other neurological diseases like multiple sclerosis. And we don't know why that is. And so, this is an issue that's going to overcome the healthcare system. It's going to overcome and affect a lot of people's lives. Here, 2 people that you grew up with in your classes going, throughout school are going to get Parkinson's disease, and this is very real, and it seems to be getting worse, and the costs for caring for patients with Parkinson are going up, and we really need to desperately develop better treatments for the generation that's suffering, but also we need to think forward as to how we're going to learn the lesson of polio, how we're going to learn the lesson of HIV, how we're going to learn the lesson of breast cancer. We need to not double down. We need to go up by a factor of 10 per year in our funding, from 200 million or 300 million to $3 billion if we're going to move the needle in this disease. And we just can't do it alone. And so those of us that entered the field as doctors, scientists, maybe both, we need to get more involved. It's not enough for us to hide behind our practices and our books. We need to get our patients involved. We need to get the family members involved, and we need to be like the March of Dimes and like the HIV group that took the FDA, by storm. And I think Tom Isaacs had it exactly right, and I think he'd be right at the front of that storm, to take over some buildings. But we haven't done that, and it's really time for us to stand up and make some noise.
That's great. One last question, because as you know, Parkinson's disease is challenging, and challenges are unpredictable, and it really affects our quality of life significantly. And it takes a lot of time and effort to manage our daily challenges. What do you say to people that are sort of feeling too overwhelmed with their own self-care? Is there anything, one thing that you think that you could suggest that they do to contribute to what you're discussing today?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think that it is really important to emphasize always take care of yourself first.
Right.
And the majority of the time when you're feeling overwhelmed and over the top, sometimes it's because your clinicians, your practitioners are missing something because they're so blinded looking at your tremor and stiffness and slowness, and they're not treating these non-motor symptoms that are so treatable: depression, anxiety, sleep dysfunction, as just three big examples of the big three. And so the first thing I would say is, it's so treatable. Like, make sure if you're feeling like that, get treatment. The second thing I would say is find a way that you can contribute to the cause where it brings meaning to your life, meaning and purpose to your life. And that's different in different people. So in some people, that's writing a check. In other people, that's walking a race. In
Right.
others, it's helping somebody else with Parkinson's disease. It's signing a petition. Find, the way in which you can do things. But the one thing each one of us can do, even if we're feeling overwhelmed, is tell others, even those who are touched by Parkinson but don't have it themselves, we need you to step up for us and fight for us, as a vulnerable population. And so the one thing I could tell you, inspire other people. That's the key. And maybe part of the answer is looking beyond the Parkinson to inspiring the people around you without Parkinson, rallying them to the cause and saying, you got to help us. We need some help here. And it's okay to ask for help. And so be as charismatic and inspirational and disruptive as you can.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okun, for your time, insight, and expert advice. It was greatly appreciated. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you found your time with us helpful and educational. We'll be sending you a link of the recording for this webinar in the next few days, and you can share it with others. And always remember, you may not have control over your diagnosis, but how you face the challenges that this diagnosis brings into your life is really yours to determine. So focus on optimizing your quality of life, educate yourself, empower yourself, and celebrate your daily victories. And also remember in these turbulent times to be smart and stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.